Hello Internet, welcome to part 5 of our series on Socrates and Plato. Today we're going to be discussing the argument from form of life for the immortality of the soul. Be sure to watch part 1 if you haven't already. I'll include a link over there, and I'll also include links to parts 2, 3 and 4 if you're interested. But there'll be some important background information in part 1, so make sure you watch that if you haven't already. So the argument from form of life is discussed in the Phaedo, and it's the final argument discussed in the Phaedo, and Plato seems to have viewed it as the most decisive since it sort of ends the discussion and more or less convinces all involved. So let's get into the argument itself. So the gist of the argument, I'll give you the gist and then I'll go into more detail. The gist of the argument from form of life is that the soul, by its very nature, is alive, and thus it cannot die without ceasing to be a soul. So by the very nature of soul, it must be immortal, it must never die. So Socrates begins the argument by making the following claim. Nothing can become the opposite of itself. If it does become the opposite of itself, it ceases to exist. To give an example, hot cannot become cold without ceasing to exist. Hot, by its very nature, is not cold. And this seems to be obviously true, so he seems to be off to a good start. Socrates then moves on to the following closely related claim, that this is true not only of opposites, but also things that necessarily contain opposites. So to give an example to illustrate the point, fire and snow may not be conceptual opposites. Fire necessarily contains heat, otherwise it won't be fire, and snow necessarily contains cold. As a result, fire cannot become cold without ceasing to exist, and snow cannot become hot without ceasing to exist. Now, obviously, nowadays we know that cold is simply the absence of heat. Socrates and co. wouldn't have known that back then, but we can sort of modify the example to get basic insight. So again, this seems like a plausible claim. He then moves on to the following claim. The soul always contains life. Now to us that might seem a little bit odd, but for the ancient Greeks, the soul was the principle of life in all living things. It's what made them be living things, what made them alive. So for them this would have seemed undeniable. Maybe have a think about that. Can we make sense of that given our sort of modern assumptions and presuppositions? So from this he deduces that the soul can never admit the opposite of life, which is death. And this follows from steps 2 and 3, and it does seem to do so. Socrates then goes on to highlight that that which cannot admit death is immortal and indestructible. This seems to be initially plausible, but I'm going to come back to this later on and I'll discuss it in more detail. And from this he concludes that therefore the soul is immortal and indestructible, and this seems to follow from the previous steps. So the argument seems to be valid in that the conclusion follows from the premises. Whether or not the premises are true, or whether there's some form of equivocation going on, that's another question, and it's something which I'll discuss in the next slide. And so the argument kind of makes sense. The gist is that the soul, by its very nature, is the principle of life. Things cannot contain their opposite, so the soul cannot admit of death, and if it can't admit of death, it must be immortal and indestructible. Or perhaps more simply put, the soul by its very nature is alive, so it's alive and thus immortal. Now this argument in its conclusions seems to command widespread agreement among Socrates and his interlocutors. Now normally throughout this series I haven't discussed the historical and narrative context of these dialogues. I will very briefly here because it's quite a sort of sad and touching scene. The Phaedo is actually the last dialogue of Socrates in that he dies at the end of it. He's been sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. He's made to drink the hemlock, and as he's dying he discusses philosophy with his sort of disciples, and he discusses the immortality of the soul, which kind of makes sense because he's about to die. And he goes through the 3 arguments that we've looked at so far in this series. He doesn't necessarily convince them with those ones. He then comes on to this final argument, and more or less he convinces them, although some of them admit some misgivings. And after sort of convincing them, he then peacefully dies, and it's a very sad sort of scene, and it's clear that his followers really sort of loved him and cared for him. So if you want to read that, then please do so. I'll include a link in the description. How historically accurate the account is open to debate. Certainly from a biological and medical perspective, it's a bit suspect in the account. The poison works from Socrates' feet up with his body slowly going numb, and modern medicine tells us that's not how hemlock poisoning would work. So it's probably not 100% historically accurate, but perhaps there's some truth in it. Either way, it's a good read, so have a look at that in the description if you're interested. So now on to some objections. Two that occur to me are, well, first, the argument assumes the existence of a soul. It assumes that we have physical bodies and that we have souls. And you might challenge that. You might think that all there is to human beings are our physical bodies, and you might simply deny the existence of a soul. If you deny the existence of a soul outright, then the whole argument isn't going to float. You're not even going to be able to get it off the ground. The question is the soul immortal? Well, that assumes that there is a soul. Second, and perhaps a more subtle objection, the argument seems to assume that ceasing to exist and dying are synonyms. And I might challenge that. Perhaps dying is a biological phenomenon that applies to living organisms, but which is conceptually separable from ceasing to exist. So, for example, take a non-living object, such as a chair or a table. They quite clearly exist. You can then make them cease to exist by burning them in a fire or breaking them up into tiny little bits. You can make them cease to exist, but you can't kill them, you can't make them die because they're not alive. And so if you can separate conceptually and practically ceasing to exist and dying, then they're not synonyms. And if that's the case, then perhaps dying is a biological phenomenon which doesn't, or even conceptually can't, apply to the soul. Nevertheless, the soul can still cease to exist. This would challenge step 5 in the argument, and thus the conclusion, whilst accepting steps 1 through 4. So those are just two objections that occur to me. There may be responses that Socrates and Plato could make. Have a think about those. If you can think of them, put them in the comments. I'd be interested in seeing what you think. There are probably other objections too, so again, if you can think of any, put them in the comments. I'd be interested in seeing them. I hope you enjoyed these last few episodes. These last few ones have obviously been focused on the immortality of the soul. If you found these ones interesting, there are other philosophers who have thought about the immortality of the soul, such as Descartes and Aristotle, and we can have a look at some of their arguments. It must be said, for me personally, I don't find Plato/Socrates' arguments terribly convincing. I think Descartes and Aristotle's are better. Whether they're successful, that's another question, but we could certainly do some videos looking at those, so let me know if that's of interest to you. I think that's it for this video. We've got one more in our series on Socrates and Plato. We're going to be looking at sort of Plato's psychology, ethics, and politics. It's going to be quite a long episode, about 10 to 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes at the longest. We'll see. So I think that's it. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. That's it from me. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.